So tell me just a little bit about like what a lack of self-love has done, where a lack of self-love has taken you in your life, what experiences it has led you to, and I guess kind of like when, what made you decide to start learning to love yourself and what steps you took.
I think the first thing that I can recall as like lack of self-love, I experienced it probably in high school. I was like completely unhappy with myself. So I had bouts of eating disorders. Growing up, I had some kind of trauma where everything had to look really, really nice. But everything inside could be all jumbled and broken. As long as I was thin, I was put together. So like those expectations were put on me. So as I started getting older and I was in high school, I started like getting a little bit of weight on me. I would go days, weeks without eating food, just so I could fit in, just so I thought that I could be pretty, accepted, loved by other people, stuff like that. So that's where the first instance of lack of self-love came into my life. There was another instance too when I was in high school, my first boyfriend, first love. It was an extremely toxic relationship. Like he would do things, he would always cheat on me. He would spit on me. He would hide under my bed. He would control everything that I wore. I couldn't have friends. I thought that was him loving me. But now that I look back, like that was just a really toxic situation. I continue to stay with it because I needed that acceptance. I needed that, what I thought was love from him. But it was because I just didn't have that love in myself. There were a couple other things that happened as well. So like the biggest part of lack of self-love in my life. So that tone and that relationship set tones for the rest of my relationships until I got clean. I would find myself in very toxic relationships with men who were pretty much not mentally stable. I had another relationship in my early 20s where he ended up choking me with a phone cord. And my dad had to come to the police station and come and get me at 3 in the morning. I continued on with that relationship as well until he passed away. But the biggest lack of self-love was when I became an addict. Lack of self-love. When I became an addict, there were things that I'd always told myself that I wouldn't do. So when it comes to using of drugs, everything was off the table. I mean, was on the table. Like everything was available. I was so empty inside from the patterns of the eating disorders, patterns of the toxic relationships. So I literally took one thing and went into the other. And I went into substance abuse. I was trying to fill those voids. I was empty. I didn't know how to fix myself. I just knew that these things were temporary and they made me feel good for the minute. So I ended up doing things in active addiction that I told myself that I would never do. I was using substances that I always told myself I wouldn't do. I was at any means necessary getting the narcotics, and that was like with me selling myself because I had no self-worth whatsoever at all. I would be gone at months at a time. I wasn't seeing my son. The turning point in my life, I remember the day of basically my personal surrender. I remember feeling completely worthless. I remember I had this overwhelming feeling over my body. I was crying, sobbing, and I was reflecting back on, I felt that I was a terrible mother. I was a terrible daughter. I was a terrible sister. And I remember asking my higher power, like, you know, why why has this happened to me? Like, I don't want this life anymore. Like, please take this from me. Please take it from me. And it took me going to jail to kind of pump the brakes. I remember one of my visits when I was in jail, and my mother came in to see me. And at this point, she was just trying to get through to me. And I was hurting so bad that I was lashing out. It was everybody's fault, and I was lashing out. And my mom had brought my son up during the visit, and I remember taking the phone and just banging it on the window, telling her like Xavier would be better off with another mother. And that was like after I'd had that visit, I went back to the dorm and I thought to myself, that is the furthest thing from the truth. I didn't know how to work through this process. I didn't know how to start loving myself. I just knew that this was something that I needed to start doing. Nobody was going to do it for me. It took me being court ordered to treatment and this path of self-discovery. I had lost everything. In the process, I was going through a divorce, could not see my son without supervised visits. I was dating drug dealers, you know, we could go on and on and on. But the best thing that ever happened to me was I was forced to work on myself. I'll be honest, like the first 90 days was like a completely like discovery. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up. I just had to start figuring things out. Throughout my early recovery days, and I'm still considered early recovery, but throughout the first like year, I would find myself in toxic relationships again. It was like the pattern was still there. They had very similar traits that the gentleman from my previous life had. And it took one of my really good friends and my sponsor to say, listen, this is what you have told me about the gentleman in your past, and this is what you're telling me about these guys that you currently choose. Do you not see the similarities? And she basically said they're old behaviors, and it got to the point to where they were so toxic. These gentlemen that I was dating, they ended up, they were just temporary situations. You know, she finally looked at me one day and said, you know, Makenzie, I think you should like hold off dating anybody until you work a certain step. And I don't know anybody, I work 12-step program. And that is actually what has helped me learn to love myself. So when she said it to me, I thought, you know, she's probably right. She's like, you can't afford another disaster like that. And especially when I was so vulnerable and new and trying to love myself, trying to learn this new life, to introduce somebody else in that was toxic and still wasn't working on themselves, it just was something I couldn't do. So for the longest time, I think I stopped dating people. And I started working steps, and then I got to a point now today, like where if people will say something to me that I feel like is a projection, like very recently, I think it was last year, I went to a meeting, and at this meeting, I had somebody come up to me and tell me that I was getting wide. And that for me was something hard. But what I ended up doing was I just had to, of course it hurt my feelings briefly, but then I just had to basically take a step back and say, like, for that person to say that to me, like, they're hurting too, right? And their perception of me is like a direct reflection of themselves, a mirror image of themselves. So I couldn't take it personal. I had to actually get to a point in my life today where I'm okay with where I'm at. The weight that I may have gained because I've got clean, just where I'm at today, the relationship that I'm rebuilding with my son, this whole journey is for me. I can't sit around and wait for people to love me the way that I expect them to do, because those are expectations that are unfair. If I don't find it within myself and I can't love myself wholly, how can I expect somebody else to? If I don't even know who I am or what I want, how can I expect somebody else to?
And you had mentioned that the weight, because even when you were using though, and you might have been thinner, were you happy?
No.
Because now you're happy, right? I mean, you can say that you're genuinely happy and it doesn't matter what your weight is.
No, it doesn't matter. I was completely miserable at 120 pounds and 5'7", completely, utterly miserable. Today, even if I had to do this life by myself, I could do it by myself.
Was it hard when you first stopped dating?
Yes. Yeah, I remember when I was, a lot of the girls in my house, they were actively dating. They were doing this and they were doing that, and they had boyfriends, and it was extremely difficult because here I am and I want to have fun, but I had to dig deep and I was working steps. And I wanted to go out and have fun, but I knew it was important, because I knew that anything worthy or worthwhile of value would come later on in life. I remember one of the biggest things that my friend Allie said to me was, Makenzie, would your higher power, which is God, would he bring a man worthy to be in your life if you have not rebuilt your relationship with your son first?
That's powerful.
That stopped me.
So you had to start there.
I mean, and it's true. For me, it was true. And it was just like a huge siren. Because if I didn't have that relationship back with the first man in my life, which is my son, why is God going to bring me somebody that is worthy?
And would it be fair to bring somebody when you're not ready for them yet?
Right.
At the same time. So how long did you stay by yourself to focus? Like, how long did you focus on you?
It took probably about 8 months. During that time, like, I would occasionally talk to guys and stuff like that, but there was never any kind of like full-blown relationship at all. They ended up being just temporary situations, but I spent about 8 months by myself.
That's awesome. How long prior to that had it been since you had been alone?
I can't tell you if that's ever really happened.
Wow. So that's huge. Huge.
I can't tell you that's ever really happened. From the age of 15 on.
And so you mentioned that when you went to treatment and it was then that you started to learn who you were, and up until then you didn't even know what you wanted to do when you like grew up. At what age was it that you actually went into treatment and started to learn who you were?
36.
So 36 years old.
Yes, 36. I was newly divorced, and had a whole career and everything. And I came down to Portsmouth, and I was put into an environment and I didn't know a single person. I just knew that I could not stand the life that I was living. I hated the way that I felt about myself, and I had to figure out the best way I could to do this. I had to, because like, I want to live a fuller life. For me, the true meaning of peace for me is peace within. It is. If I'm constantly in turmoil with how I feel about myself, or I'm not really living in peace.
And prior to starting to use substances or Um, just self, so prior to that though, you had a husband, a family, you have a college degree, right? You had a career and you were making decent money, right? I
Yeah.
mean, so from the outside looking in, you had the perfect life.
Yeah, yeah, I had everything that would be considered like the American dream, I guess. Um, I had a wonderful career. I had a beautiful child. We owned our home. We owned our cars. Um, there wasn't. I was working as a financial analyst. There wasn't a thing that I needed or wanted. But there was still that lack of self-love. Like I pointed out, I not only did I struggle with eating disorder earlier on when I was a teenager, even in my marriage. After I had my son, I had gained a tremendous amount of weight, and that eating disorder kind of crept back in.
So it's always been something,
Yep.
whether it was the eating disorder and then later substances, or men allowing you to determine your worth, I guess,
Yeah.
almost.
Yeah, I was trying to fill those voids with anything outside of myself. Because I thought that would be the fix or the solution. But every single time I would get thin or I would get a new boyfriend, I would be toxic or a drug or something like that, I would still be empty and there would still be that void.
And so once you went to treatment and you started working the 12 steps and you were by yourself for the first time, how long or what finally sparked in you that you finally started to even just like yourself? And how did that start to happen?
Um, I think it was like a gradual process. Um, I think it was just something that I built myself up with coping skills, and the self-love. So when I started working these steps, I started seeing like um, things that I had done, character defects, stuff like that. One of my major character defects is low self-esteem. Right. I had to hit that head on and face that. And for that low self-esteem, I had to turn it into a spiritual principle, which is like self-worth, self-love, something like that. So it's something I still continue to practice. But what I basically did was, if somebody would come up to me and they would like basically pull my inventory, or they would say, Makenzie, you're rude, or you're this, or you're heavy, or you're not this, you're not this. I just had to take a step back because those are their feelings. They're valid, but it's not my truth. I had to separate myself from the way that they feel and what they thought, and I had to take a step back and say, well, how do you feel about this? So it was something that I had to do over time. Yeah. I like to consider it, and I often refer to it as like a bubble that's around me. So I have this bubble that I've put around myself, and it's an imaginary bubble, but I put it around myself so that I can't be affected by like what people's opinions, thoughts, and words are towards me.
That's awesome. But I'm sure that it took time to get there.
It did. It did, because I've spent a huge amount of time hating myself. I spent a huge amount of time saying terrible, negative things in my own head about myself. And I've spent a huge amount of time trying to overcome that. And what I can't do today is let somebody else put me back in that place. It's extremely important that what I feel about myself and what I think about myself is the only thing that matters.
So what are some things that you do? Like, what are some of your practices? I know you said you work the 12 steps, you have a sponsor. What are some other ways that you make sure that you are practicing things that encourage self-love and support self-love?
Yeah. So I like to take baths, self-love. I love to, just today I gave myself a little manicure and pedicure, right? Yeah. And now that
Okay.
yeah, now that we're on this quarantine, and I can't tan, I have a self tanner, so I've been putting that on. I like to do facials. Another thing too, I like to do that gets me out of myself. I know we're talking about self-love, but I like to get out of myself. Like if I'm so concerned about, poor Makenzie, you're this, you're that, and I get like that, what I like to do is be of service work. So that's doing something for someone without expecting anything in return. And that to me comes in the form of sponsorship, other girls that I sponsor, or other activities that I do for the fellowships that I'm involved in, stuff like that. So that helps too. Clean, I like to clean.
So self-care, taking care of yourself, making sure you're healthy, and what about, because I know you went from being in jail, having supervised visits with your son. What is that relationship with your son like today?
Oh, wow. So the relationship I have with my son today, so now I go back and see him. I continue to stay down here. I was sent down to Portsmouth. I continued to stay down here because for me, it was more important. The quality of life that I had down here, the support I had down here, and the life that I was trying to build down here was what was keeping me clean. It was keeping me clean. I was becoming a productive member of society. I was becoming a better mom and a better person. Okay. So I go and see him every other weekend. Right.
Is it supervised or is it unsupervised?
Unsupervised. Yes, he at one point too during I think it was last summer break, he came down here and stayed with me in Wheelersburg for about 7 days. And that was something that was a huge issue before with my ex-husband. But the fact that my ex-husband allowed him to come down here for 7 days, like he trusted me to make sure he was bathed and fed and all that for 7 days. So that's what that relationship's like today. Today I can now get him stuff for his birthday. I can take him out to eat. He can come down here and stay with me. I could get his hair cut, stuff like that. That's what the relationship's like today. I'm actually just waiting for, hopefully one day he says he just wants to come and live.
Oh, that's awesome. How old is he now?
He just turned 11 last Wednesday.
Oh, that's awesome. So where are you at, like, career wise? Did you go back to the career that you had prior to this? So what are you doing for a career now?
So now I work at the treatment facility that helped save my life. I am a case manager. I had contemplated and I've been back and forth about going back into the financial advisor business, analyst business. But the company that saved my life, that helped save my life. When I was in treatment, I had always told myself, like, I'm going to come back here and work. I think I'm going to work here. And it took probably about a year after I had completed and all that. And I came back in. And now I'm a case manager. So I get to help both men and women who suffer from the same disease, the disease of addiction. I get to help them stabilize and hopefully help them learn that there is life after drugs.
Awesome. And are you happier today than you were when you had everything that the world tells us we should have?
Yeah, because they're just material things. They are. And I knew back then when I had left my marriage and wanted a divorce, I literally told him, like, you can keep all this. Because I don't ever want to be defined by that. Because there's no real value in any of that for me. There's just not.
And something I forgot to ask when you were telling this is, so when you had experienced the trauma, when you had the eating disorder, and then you started using substances to kind of deal with the pain or fill that void, did you ever reach out, or what held you back from reaching out?
I never reached out. I think what has held me back from that was my own self, my pride, my ego, asking for help, in fear of being vulnerable, in fear of being judged, in fear of not being perfect. Would there have been people that would have helped me? Yeah. And that was a constant that played throughout. Like if it wasn't the eating disorder, it was the substance abuse, or it was the unhealthy, toxic relationships. Um, those were little things that I always kept to myself, and I would isolate with those items, and I would not ask for help. And that was all on me. It was my pride, my ego, all the above. Embarrassment. I was afraid people would judge me. Mackenzie's not perfect, so I didn't ask.
So do you feel, or okay, I'm trying to think. Do you feel that it is important for other women then to speak their truth and share so that we others know like they are not alone?
Yeah, it's extremely important. So it's not only important for them to share and speak their truth, because when we share and speak that truth, it takes power away, right? But on the same hand, it's not always about us, right? If we share and we speak that truth, we could help somebody else.
So that they might not have that fear of judgment that you said and that I've had, and that pride, because exactly, if more people share their story and their truth, then it's less scary.
It is, and that's what we're taught. When in in a lot of the rooms and self-help rooms, we're taught that we should share, we should take the power away, and if we share, like people don't have to suffer, because sometimes,
Absolutely.
yeah, because sometimes what we share could be a solution for somebody else. It could be a solution for somebody else.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Makenzie, I think that your story is amazing and so powerful, and I honestly truly appreciate you being so vulnerable and willing to share your story. And um, I just genuinely thank you, and I admire you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Ash.
You're welcome.
Thank
Have a
you.
good night, Makenzie. I love you.
I love you. Bye.
Bye.